My hands still remember the tremor, the sharp scrape of my kitchen chair against the tile, the way my pulse pounded as if my body had already decided to run. The glow of the laptop screen lit my face, casting me in a light that felt too cold for the decision I had just made. 2 round-trip tickets gleamed on the confirmation page. Key West, 2 passengers, Juliet Green and her 8-year-old son, Mason. To anyone else, it was a simple purchase, a vacation, a trip to the sea. To me, it was a declaration. It's over, Juliet. The shadows of 3 long years were ending. I had chosen life again. 3 years earlier, my husband, Ryan Green, had been declared dead. They told me it was an accident, some meaningless snowmobile mishap on a business trip. There was no body, only a death certificate and the pitiful eyes of an official who recited condolences like a script. I was holding Mason in my arms when Ryan's coworker mumbled, "He's gone. I'm so sorry." My knees gave out. The world cracked open, swallowing us in a silence I thought would never end. From that moment, I lived like a ghost, raising my son with walls so high even his small hands couldn't reach me. Ryan had once been my miracle. Charismatic, sharp-witted, a man who could light up a room simply by entering it. We met when I was 25, a junior analyst at a bank in Atlanta. He walked in with the confidence of someone who already knew the answers to every question, and I fell into his orbit before I even realized. We married a year later. In the beginning, our life felt like a storybook. Hiking trails, candlelit dinners, spontaneous road trips. Ryan's career in venture capital soared, and I felt proud standing by his side. Then Mason was born, and I believed it would anchor Ryan to us. But instead of coming home, he drifted further away, his nights consumed by calls, his days swallowed by travel. I begged him to slow down, to see the little boy who adored him. He always promised things would change. Instead, he vanished. When the call came about his accident, I told myself it was another forgotten trip, another disappearing act. But by the 4th day, his phone silent, the truth landed. They said the ice was thin, the current strong, and his body unrecoverable. I buried an empty urn because there was nothing else to bury. I sold my wedding ring to help with the mortgage, found a job at the bank, and devoted every breath to Mason. He didn't ask much about his father, but when he did, the blade twisted deeper. I swore I'd survive for him, even if I felt hollow inside. So when I clicked confirm on those tickets, it wasn't about beaches or palm trees. It was a vow that Mason and I deserved joy again. When I told him, his face broke into a smile so bright it hurt. "You'll be happier there, right, Mom?" he whispered. I didn't know how to answer. But I knew this was the start of something new. The morning of the flight, Mason was up before sunrise, dragging his little blue suitcase across the floor like it carried treasure. His joy was infectious. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of excitement. We wove through the chaos of the airport together, his small hand clutching mine. On the plane, he pressed his nose to the window, marveling at the clouds. I let myself breathe, telling myself this trip was about moving forward. But then his voice dropped to a whisper. "Mom," he said, tugging my sleeve. "That's Dad." My blood turned to ice. I followed his gaze down the aisle. A man sat 2 rows ahead talking to a young blonde woman. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and sunglasses, but something about his shoulders, the tilt of his hand on the armrest, the cadence of his movements, it was too familiar. I laughed shakily. "Sweetheart, you must be mistaken." But then he turned slightly, and I saw it. A scar under his jawline, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. A scar I had kissed 100 times. Mason's eyes were wide. "Mom, it's Dad." My chest tightened, my breath shallow. For the rest of the flight, I stole glances, trying to convince myself it was grief playing tricks on me, yet the whisper in my heart wouldn't die. What if it's him? When we landed in Key West,
The salt air and bright sun should have been freeing. Mason ran ahead, bursting with joy about seashells and sandcastles. But my mind was stuck on the plain, on that scar, on the impossible. That evening, after Mason slept, I stepped onto our balcony to breathe in the night air. Then I heard voices, an argument from the balcony below, a woman's sharp retort, and then a man's voice, frustrated, unmistakable. My heart stopped when I heard his name, Ryan. I leaned over, and there he was, barefoot, no disguise this time, alive and arguing with another woman who called him hers. Shock rooted me to the spot. My husband, the man I mourned, the man whose absence shaped every inch of our lives, was alive and had chosen another life. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I stood frozen, trembling in the dark. Inside, Mason stirred, murmuring in his sleep. I tucked him in, whispering soothing lies, while my world cracked a second time. That night, I couldn't rest. Driven by something I couldn't name, I walked down to the hotel bar. And there he was, Ryan Green, alive, older, sipping bourbon as if the last 3 years hadn't broken me. He sat slouched at the bar, a glass of bourbon catching the low light, the kind of drink he always ordered when he needed to think. For a moment, I simply watched him, taking in the new lines on his face, the weariness in this posture. He looked older, heavier with secrets, but it was him. My body moved before I could stop it, and suddenly I was 2 seats away. "Tough night?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound casual. He turned, startled, then gave a half smile.
"You could say that."
His voice cut straight through me, achingly familiar. I held my breath, playing the role of a stranger. He swirled his drink and muttered about couple drama, about not being understood. My hands trembled under the counter. He didn't recognize me. He poured his confessions into the air between us, not realizing he was speaking to the wife he had abandoned. 3 years ago, I lost everything, he said softly. I had to start over. Leave things behind. People, too. People. That's what he called us. I bit down on every urge to scream, keeping my face composed. When he finished his drink, he gave me a polite nod. "Thanks for listening. You're easier to talk to than most people." Then he walked out, leaving me shattered among the bar stools. The next day, the beach was bright, the waves carrying laughter and freedom. Mason dug into the sand with determined joy, building towers against the tide. For a moment, I almost forgot the weight pressing down on me. Until I heard the scream. A young woman's voice, panicked and desperate. I spun around and saw her, Camilla, the one from the balcony, kneeling beside a man sprawled on the sand. My stomach dropped. Ryan. His body was limp, his skin pale under the sun. Mason stopped digging, staring in confusion. "Mom, isn't that—" "Stay here," I shouted, running. I fell to my knees beside him, instincts taking over. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak. I tilted his chin, clearing his airway, covering his face with my towel. "He's alive," I whispered, more to myself than to Camilla, who sobbed beside me. "Go get help, now." She ran, and I stayed, clutching his wrist, hating him, saving him. His eyelids fluttered, his lips moved. "Juliet." My body locked, the sound of my name from his mouth tearing through me. "Yes," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "It's me." His eyes opened, filled with shock, guilt, recognition. The moment shattered me all over again. When help arrived, they lifted him slowly, checking his vitals. Camilla returned breathless, but his eyes never left mine. "Juliet, please. We have to talk." I stood, my voice ice. "Not here. Tonight, 10 p.m., at the bar." He nodded, broken. I walked back to Mason, who clutched his toy shovel like a lifeline. "Mom, was it really?" I knelt, hugging him tight. We'll talk about it later, sweetheart. Right now, we go inside. My heart pounded with dread. Tonight, I would finally hear the truth. At 10 sharp, he walked into the bar. No disguise this time. His eyes searched mine with hesitation. I didn't give him the comfort of small talk. 2 minutes, I said flatly. Why did I bury an empty urn? Why did I raise our son alone for 3 years? He flinched as if struck, his hands rubbed together, restless. I was in trouble. That investment, it wasn't just business. I borrowed money, too much from the wrong people, dangerous people. If I stayed, you and Mason would have been targets, so I disappeared.
My throat burned. So you let me tell a 5-year-old his dad was gone forever?
You let me break myself into pieces to keep us alive while you lived? He dropped his gaze. I thought I was protecting you. Then, when it was over, when I paid everything back, I couldn't face you. I had already destroyed us, and His voice faltered. I found someone else. Camilla. The name echoed in my skull like a curse. I felt sick. You built a new life while we drowned. I spat. He shook his head, ashamed. I met her later. She doesn't know any of this, but Juliet, I never stopped thinking about Mason, about you. My hands clenched into fists. You don't get to speak about us, not after leaving me to hold everything. Tears filled his eyes. I don't deserve forgiveness. But please, let me be his dad again. Let me at least try. I stared at him, torn between rage and the echo of love that refused to die. Finally, I said, tomorrow, 11 a.m. at the hotel cafe. You can see him, but this isn't forgiveness. It's a door barely open, and if you slam it shut, it stays closed forever. He nodded, relief in his eyes, and I turned away, shaking but unbroken. That night, I lay awake beside Mason, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. Tomorrow, everything would change again. I arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early and chose a corner table where the light fell soft and ordinary, as if the morning itself were urging us towards something gentler than the night before. Mason skipped beside me, thinking only of hot cakes and orange juice, blissfully unaware that the man waiting near the window was the one who had rearranged our lives by vanishing. When Mason finally noticed him, he stopped, the way a child pauses at the edge of a pool to test the temperature of the water. I told him yes, that it was his dad, and watched my son walk toward a truth he could not yet name. Ryan stood and lowered himself to Mason's height, and for a long breath neither of them spoke. Then Mason lifted his arms in a tentative hug, and the smallest sound escaped Ryan, a broken exhale that was closer to a prayer than a word. They sat together, and the waitress brought hotcakes, and the world did not end. It tilted. It changed shape, but it did not end. I stayed quiet while they spoke. Mason catalogues second-grade victories and tragedies with solemn importance. Spelling test, a soccer goal that bounced in off the post, the class pet escaping for an hour and returning on its own, a miracle no one could explain. Ryan listened as if each detail were a bead he could not afford to drop, nodding, asking small questions, learning his son's cadence as if relearning a language he once spoke fluently. When Mason finally whispered the question he truly cared about, "Did you miss me?" Ryan's answer was simple and immediate and not theatrical. More than anything in the world. It was not absolution, but it was not nothing. I watched the words land in my son and soften the place that grief had hardened too soon. After breakfast, Mason asked if Ryan could come to the beach. I hesitated, measuring every possible outcome against the weight of my son's hope, then nodded with the brittle courage of someone who knows there is no safe path forward. only the right one for now. The three of us walked toward the water, Mason swinging between us for a few steps before letting go and sprinting ahead. For an hour, the tide erased and rewrote our efforts, and laughter found us by habit rather than permission. I saw Ryan on his knees in the sand, explaining how to brace a moat so the next wave would not steal the castle outright. And I saw Mason leaning close, absorbing, trusting. A joy I had not allowed myself to feel in years nudged my ribs from the inside, and its touch hurt. I stood ankle deep where the foam laced my shins and understood that happiness could mend and wound at once. When the sun grew sharp and the wind grew mischievous, we called it. Mason hugged his father again, this time without the tremor of uncertainty, and asked if he would see him tomorrow. I told him we would take things one day at a time. On the walk back, Mason's voice tumbled over itself with plans that moved too quickly for my heart. Sand forts that would withstand the morning tide. A shell collection he wanted to start with his dad. Mango popsicles and soccer practice. And maybe you can come to my game when we're home. I squeezed his hand and tried to anchor him without dimming that new light. That evening, the balcony breeze smelled of salt and sun-warmed limestone. I arranged a blanket around my shoulders and watched the water gather itself into slow silver. When the knot came, soft as a moth's wing, I already knew it would be him. He stepped through the sliding door and stopped, as if seeking permission from the air itself, not just from me. He said Mason was extraordinary, which I already knew, and he said the years he had missed looked different now that he had touched his son's hair and heard his small voice say tomorrow. He moved closer to the railing, but not closer to me, and told me again that he was sorry. Sorry in a way that didn't demand an answer. Sorry in a way that finally sounded like truth. I let the sea speak for a moment because it was steadier than my breath, then told him what the terms of our future would be if there was to be any future at all. I said that Mason's heart was not a door you open and close depending on weather or courage. I said there would be calls before visits, plans kept or canceled with honesty, no sudden appearances at school events, no promises offered on the high tide of emotion and then stolen by the low tide of fear. I said the first lie would be the last, that if he chose dishonesty again, he would not simply be asked to leave. He would be required to vanish from the story for good. He listened without interruption, only once lifting a hand as if to steady himself against the railing. When he finally spoke, he said yes to everything, not because he expected me to relax the terms later, but because boundaries were the only bridge left between us that might hold weight. He told me he understood that what he had asked for at the cafe, another chance at fatherhood, was a privilege, not a right, and that he would earn each step like a man crossing a river on unfamiliar stones. I did not forgive him on that balcony, and I did not pretend forgiveness was simple arithmetic that could be solved by adding breakfast to a beach afternoon and dividing by tears. I only allowed the possibility of repair to exist in the same room with our history. He nodded as if that small allowance were more grace than he deserved. When he left, he pressed his palm briefly to the glass, not expecting me to mirror it, then closed the door with the careful finality of someone who had learned how easily doors slam. I stayed outside until the air cooled and the tide smoothed itself. Inside, Mason rolled in his sleep and murmured something about shells. I lay down beside him and stared at the dark, and for the first time since the plane, my heart did not rattle against my ribs like a locked drawer. It beat steady, cautious, brave. Morning would come with its questions, but for now, the immediate truth was enough. My son had found a voice he had been missing, and I had found a way to let it sing without losing mine. The next morning broke with a restless kind of quiet, The kind that makes you wonder if the world is holding its breath. Mason was up early, his small hands fumbling with his shoelaces while chattering about seashells and pancakes, as if yesterday had been nothing more than a strange dream. I envied his resilience, his ability to fold the impossible into the ordinary. I, on the other hand, felt like every nerve in my body was stretched thin. Today, Ryan would see his son again, not as a ghost or a stranger, but as the father who had left us behind. At the cafe, sunlight spilled across white tablecloths, making the room too bright for the heaviness in my chest. Ryan was already there, drumming his fingers on the table, a nervous habit he had always carried. Mason slowed when he saw him, his face caught between doubt and hope. I nodded gently. "Yes, honey. That's your dad." He walked forward cautiously, and Ryan stood, lowering himself to meet him eye to eye. "Hey, champ," Ryan said, voice unsteady. "It's me." The silence between them felt like a chasm. Then Mason took one step forward and wrapped his arms around him. It was not the dramatic, movie-like reunion I had feared or expected. It was small, trembling, fragile, but real. They sat together, Mason's plate quickly covered in syrup and crumbs as he talked with the unfiltered joy only a child can manage. He told Ryan about soccer practice, about the spelling test he had almost aced, about the sandcastle that collapsed under the tide. Ryan listened with his whole body, leaning forward, eyes soft, drinking in every word, like a man who hadn't realized how thirsty he was. When Mason finally whispered, "Did you miss me?" Ryan's reply came fast, certain, raw. "More than anything." Mason's shoulders relaxed, and the smile that bloomed across his face was one I hadn't seen in years. When breakfast ended, Mason asked if his dad could come to the beach. My instinct screamed, no. But I looked at my son, at the fragile thread of happiness stitching itself across his small heart, and I said yes. On the sand, they built castles together, their laughter carrying on the breeze. For a moment, I saw the family we might have been if he had never left. But beneath the warmth, my heart was split in two, half joy for Mason, half rage for what had been stolen from us. Later that night, after Mason had fallen asleep, I sat on the balcony with a blanket and a cooling cup of tea. The sea moved endlessly, steady in its rhythm, as if mocking my turmoil. When the sliding door opened softly, I knew it was him. Ryan stepped out, careful, as though afraid the wrong movement might shatter what little we had rebuilt. He said Mason was extraordinary, that he wanted to be part of his life, that he couldn't walk away again. I let him speak, then I laid out the truth. If he wanted to be a father now, it would be by my rules. No broken promises, no surprises, no lies. One mistake, and he would be gone forever. He nodded, tears brimming, saying he understood, that he would earn every moment. I didn't forgive him. Not then, maybe not ever. But I allowed the possibility that Mason could have his father back, even if I never got my husband again. That night, when Mason stirred in his sleep and murmured, "We're happy, right, Mom?" I stroked his hair and whispered, "Yes." For the first time in years, I said it and meant it. Weeks passed in a blur of contradictions. Ryan kept showing up, sometimes cautious, sometimes too eager, but always on time, always with a kind of quiet desperation in his eyes. Mason clung to him at first, then slowly adjusted, as if relearning what it meant to have a dad. They kicked a soccer ball across the beach, shared ice cream that melted faster than they could eat it, and filled the air with laughter that made my chest ache. I watched it all with mixed emotions. There were moments I caught myself staring too long, wondering if there was anything left between us beyond the ashes. But then I would remember the years I spent crying into the silence, and I knew I couldn't go back to that life. One afternoon, as Mason proudly showed Ryan a seashell he had found, Ryan caught my gaze over his son's head. His expression was a storm of guilt and longing, a silent plea I refused to answer. Later that night, he came to me again, this time not with excuses but with apologies that cracked his voice. He admitted he had been a coward, that fear had dictated every step after he disappeared, that Camilla was a shadow of a life he never really wanted. I listened, but I didn't break. I told him plainly that the past couldn't be rewritten, that he couldn't stitch me back into a marriage he had burned to the ground. But I also told him Mason deserved his father, and I wouldn't stand in the way of that bond. As the days wore on, Mason's joy became my anchor. Seeing him run toward the water with Ryan chasing close behind reminded me that children don't carry the same bitterness we adults do. They just want love, stability, presence. And in a strange way, Ryan being alive, flawed as he was, gave Mason something I never could have alone. It wasn't a happy ending, not in the storybook sense, but it was a chance. Messy, imperfect, fragile. On our last evening in Key West, the three of us sat on the balcony, the sunset painting the sky in gold and violet. Mason leaned against me, tired but smiling, while Ryan sat quietly, as if afraid to break the spell. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Mason whispered, "Mom, we're okay now, right?" I kissed the top of his head and said, "Yes, honey. We're okay." And in that moment, I realized that healing doesn't mean erasing the pain. It means learning to live with the scars and still choosing to move forward. Life rarely gives back what it takes, but sometimes it offers a second chance, not to relive the past, but to write a new chapter. For me, that chapter wasn't about rekindling an old love. It was about freedom, truth, and building a future on my terms, alongside a son who deserved nothing less than honesty and hope. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so more people can join us in these life journeys. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever faced a truth that changed everything? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.